Hello everyone and welcome to the first Oxford Energy Society event of the term. We are very excited today to have Professor Cameron Hepburn here from the Oxford Smith School. We've tried to recreate our events as closely as we can online. Sadly, there's no pizza for the end. But if you want to ask questions, you just pop them in the comment box on either Facebook or YouTube and we can read them out from here. And if you have any feedback, please feel free to get in touch via the emails on our committee page. Thank you, Professor Hepburn.
Thanks, Izzy, and hello everyone. It's very nice to be with you all. These events are, of course, very intimate and open in a pre-COVID world. Now we're digital and I guess in some sense less in camera and more public, but hopefully we can have a good discussion anyway. So my kind of exam question for the session with you all today is, will COVID-19 transform the energy sector? And what I want to do with you is just, in order to get a grip on that question, it's important to understand the underlying dynamics of the sector, where we are now in the transition that is underway. And I guess my thesis for you is that you'll see that we're at, in a sense, at or near a tipping point in the energy system. And when you have a system that's kind of at a point of criticality or is unstable in some way, a shock to that system can send it into a new basin of attraction, to use the language of complex systems, or a new equilibrium. And I think this might just be what happens here. Nobody can be certain, and time will tell. But it's a very interesting moment in energy right now. It's an interesting moment in the economy as well. So we'll run through some of those things together. I gather there's a comment section. Obviously, please keep it civil and friendly. But if you have questions to ask, don't hesitate, and I'd be happy to pick them up. I hope, if I can, as we go through. So let's see if this works. Right, yeah. So first of all, I'm going to cover the context on climate change in particular, then have a look at where we are with the COVID policy responses, because they are the things that are going to determine the long-run impact of the pandemic on the energy system in particular. Not to say that the private sector responses aren't relevant, and individual behavior is obviously also relevant, but the policy response is probably the biggest driver. And then have a look to see where we might be going next. Right, so on the climate context, it's always nice to start with a picture of an iceberg, but this is not just any old chunk of ice. We heard over the summer that some science coming out of the States suggested that the Greenland Ice Sheet, well, we know it's melting, and we know it's the largest contributor to potentially to sea level rises. Obviously, there's thermal expansion of the ocean as well. But what we discovered collectively, and it's not a joyful discovery, is that the ice sheet is probably now past a tipping point where it's just going to melt now, with very significant sea level rises baked in, effectively. The reason for this conclusion, there's always some doubt in science, and if we hope any conclusion is wrong, this would be one that I would hope is wrong. But the reason, the structure of the conclusion was that you would have to cool the global mean temperature down back to pre-industrial levels, and then 1 degree cooler than pre-industrial levels to return us to a situation where this sheet would remain intact. So we may have passed a tipping point there, with it losing more ice than it gains every year. And if so, this is pretty serious. What's this got to do with COVID and the pandemic and the response to it in the energy system? Well, it's probably obvious to some of you, and hopefully it'll be obvious to all of you fairly soon. The connection is obviously that the impacts on climate change of the energy sector are very significant. We know that under some sort of baseline scenario, we're probably heading towards 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius of warming above pre-industrial levels. We also know we're already 1 degree above pre-industrial global mean temperatures. Now, this is not a good state of affairs because we're already seeing, as I just showed you, concern that we may have passed tipping points at just a bit over 1 degree, on 1.1-ish, 1.2-ish degrees. Scientists are very concerned, as I'm sure many of you, if not all of you know, about moving beyond 1.5 degrees, and the global community in the Paris Agreement has committed to keeping temperatures well below 2 and aiming for 1.5. So a kind of benchline projection, including all of the quote optimistic policies and pledges and the rest of it of 2.5 to 3 degrees is really not good enough. Now, we had some good news just recently at the UN Secretary General, the UN General Assembly in September, I think the 22nd of September, when Xi Jinping of China announced that China would seek to reach net zero emissions by 2060 and to peak and decline before 2030. That commitment, various people have looked at estimating the impact of it. It's thought to be globally an impact of 0.2 to 0.3 degrees Celsius reduction. And the challenge now is to make sure that that commitment is translated and reflected in the 5-year plan that is, the final stages of designing that are underway now. It'll be announced in March 2021, but this is a long process and we're nearly at the end of it. But one hopes that with that announcement, there will be the opportunity for various, environmental groups and others to ensure that there is an impact of that long and medium-term announcement on the short-run decisions today. And not least because short-run decisions, particularly about capital investment that lasts for 30 or 40 years, obviously it's 2020 now, by 2060, that's 40 years away. Many of those investments will last 40 years, certainly longer than 30 years, which takes us to 2050. So this is a very significant announcement, but we arguably could be and probably will end up being more ambitious in due course, because it's in China's interest not to have its cities underwater, not to have the Himalayas melting and losing water supply to hundreds of millions of people. So this is not a kind of necessarily, it's a welcome act on the global stage. It's not necessarily purely altruistic. And I see that as a positive. This is a sensible, self-interested move. And what I suspect we see is that 2030 hopefully coming into 2025 and 2060 coming into 2050 in due course, but time will tell. The other piece of key context here is that, as I'm sure many of you know, the UK, in partnership with Italy, is hosting the Climate Change Conference, the COP, in 2021. We are expecting possibly a more ambitious climate goal to be announced from the UK government in December. This is the sort of moment where, if it was a small room with just a dozen of you, we could have a more detailed conversation, but as we're being broadcast, we can't. And I suspect we'll see more from different countries over the coming months. And we've seen various commitments, not just from the oil majors, which is very welcome, but also from other energy users like Google with its 24/7 commitment to renewables. So there's some exciting things going on. And that's the context. And I set this out because, as I say, where I think we are is a system where the public are primed for action. You'll see a bit more of this later in the talk. In many countries, not all, the political classes are primed for action. Corporates are taking action. And I know you have Chris Goodall coming up, which is very welcome, and he'll doubtless point to just how far we've got on the tech, which is actually one of the more fun things to talk about, and the costs of the clean technology set, not just your solar and your wind, and how far they've come and how far they've still got to go and how fast they're traveling, but also on batteries, on hydrogen, on electrolysis, on PEM, on alkaline. If these things don't mean anything to you, hopefully by the end of the term, they will. So the system is at a tipping point in terms of cost, in terms of citizen willingness to move, in terms of the political landscape, in terms of international relations. And then, bam, in comes COVID. So where does this leave us? So just focusing on COVID for a moment. what we've seen in relation to the energy sector is a big shock on the demand side. So demand for energy obviously fell, particularly for liquid fuels and for mobility. So whether it's aviation or just simply moving people around, driving cars and so on, the demand for energy has fallen considerably. Demand for shipping goods around the world is still there, and demand for electricity and power is as robust really as ever. I mean, took a bit of a hit as some manufacturing and other industrial uses fell away, but basically what COVID has shown us about the energy system is that this sort of shock is highly asymmetric. You hit what turn out to be the fossil sector at the moment, the oil and to a lesser extent gas, hard, but the demand for electricity, of which obviously renewables are a big component, hasn't been hit so far. Now, there have been supply side shocks as well. So if you know anyone in the business of deploying solar or wind turbines in large farms, there are in many industries, there's simply issues maintaining social distance, avoiding infection, especially if you've got people offshore clustered together on a wind turbine. These are difficult environments in which to work at the best of times, and the pandemic just makes it even more challenging. So there have been some delays in the installation of renewable capital, which is a shame. But as I say, at least on the demand side, on power, there's been relatively little effect. Overall, the IEA's World Energy Outlook, which has just been released, suggests that power demand might fall by as little as 2% globally in 2020, compared to multiple tens of percent in the other areas. Now, thinking further ahead, the energy demand is still fairly strongly coupled with economic activity and economic demand. If you look at the IMF's outlook, this is a big economic shock. We've just had, if any of you tuned in earlier today, I had the pleasure of having a public conversation with Julia Gieser from the Bank of England, and we talked about the economic projections there. In fact, it's still up online on the Oxford Martin School website if you're interested. Whether this is a V shape, a W shape, a K shape, or an L shape, hopefully not an L shape, it's not a recovery, or a U shape recovery. And this remains a big economic shock, especially in Europe, even as Asia comes back into business. Now, you see the effect of this in energy prices. I've here chosen the coal price, but actually anybody following the oil markets has seen a much more significant and pronounced impact on the cost of a barrel of oil. So that's hardly surprising. When demand drops away, you have price impacts. And we've also seen a response from OPEC, who incidentally also released a report recently on their outlook, as did BP. And I'll say a little bit more about both of them later. Now, to go to the emissions consequences of the pandemic, there are various estimates that have emerged here. These have been collected up by Brian O'Callaghan, a very able doctoral student at the Smith School. And it looks like the declines over the year are somewhere in the range of 5 to 10%. And the big question, of course, is to what degree do we capture and keep some of those declines, not just in CO2 emissions, but in particulate and other local pollution declines, which we've seen as we go forward. And there's a strong, as I'll say in just a moment, there's a strong interest in maintaining the cleaner environments that we saw during lockdown. I dare say a stronger interest in getting people back open and out again properly as we head into probably a UK national lockdown in due course, or something resembling that. But people have enjoyed the cleaner natural environment. But on the climate side, this is the short run impact. But a short run fall of 5 or 10% emissions is nothing. What you need to be aware of, and I'm sure many of you are, is that CO2 is a very long-lived pollutant. So the problem of climate change is about the integral under a curve of pollution. So you reduce the emissions by 5 or 10% in a given year, it's in the noise in terms of the impact on warming. What we have to do in order to stop warming is to get net emissions to zero. And that is true whether we are planning on stopping warming at 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees or 2.5 or 3 degrees. You actually need to bring that curve down to the origin, down to the axis, down to zero before the warming stops. And it's just a matter of how quickly we do that. So an important feature for those interested in the energy sector is that net zero energy isn't an if question. I mean, there's no point arguing about whether we will still be burning unabated fossil fuels forever. We won't. There's no doubt about that. They're going. They're either being abated, and if we have Miles Allen along at some point, he'll tell you we need to decarbonize fossil fuels. Good TED talk on the weekend. And or we're getting rid of the fossil fuels altogether. So that's not an if question, it's a when question. And the when question is answered by the answer. The answer is kind of 2040, 2050 for 1.5 degrees, perhaps a bit later definitely a bit later for 2 degrees, and a bit later if you can do a lot of greenhouse gas removal or carbon capture along the way. Anyway, let me move along. I see no comments so far. I hope that's because everything's crystal clear and you're all enjoying yourselves. One of the drawbacks of online classrooms and engagement is that I just can't, unless it's on Zoom with 50 faces looking at me, I've got no idea how interested or bored you are by this talk so far, but hopefully it's welcome. So let's move along to this pace of change. So one observation that was made as we looked at the emission reductions from UNEP is that the rate of decline in emissions required to get us onto 1.5 degree pathway is around 7.6% per annum over this decade. And that is, I just said the rate of decline from COVID is 5 to 10%. It's about the same number, same range, same order of magnitude, certainly. So one conclusion that people have drawn from this is, look, it took a global pandemic to deliver the emission reductions that we need in a single year. We can't have pandemic after pandemic to get the emissions down. And obviously that's true. And nobody wants to be hitting economic activity and people's liberties in the way that we've seen in the pandemic. So for me, what this observation tells us isn't that it's not possible to get to net zero, which is what some people seem to conclude. Or it isn't that it's kind of virtually impossibly difficult because, look, global pandemics barely got you to where you need to get to. What it tells you is that behavior change, locking people up inside and not having them move around, does something. It does reduce emissions, but it's not going to do the job. And the core of the challenge is to sort out make sure that the system itself is clean. And we have to reduce energy consumption. We have to be more efficient in how we do things. We have to lightweight our materials. We have to think about behavior change. So I'm not disagreeing with any of those points. They're made powerfully by my colleagues always at this point. When I say that fundamentally, if we don't clean up the supply side and or get the carbon dioxide removal going, then we won't get there. But we can do that, and we will do that. And if you look at the way technology is progressing and the costs are moving, there's many causes of optimism. So where are we in the pandemic now? Let me give you kind of a rubric for thinking about it. So we've had wave one. It swept through the globe, and in order to save lives and protect people's health, we've had an induced economic downturn. This recession was caused by our response to the pandemic rather than the pandemic itself. I mean, it could have been the case that we simply let the pandemic rip and it killed tens of millions of people, or rather than the million people it has already killed and many more that it will kill. But we sensibly made the decision to curtail economic activity to try and get it under control. Now, once the pandemic is under control, you're then into recovery mode. And I'm not quite sure that we're there yet. We have had recovery packages that I'll say in a moment from a number of different countries. but we're also seeing second waves moving through. And the problem we have when you shut down the economy for long enough is that you take what were previously solvent businesses or consuming energy, and you can keep them on life support for so long, but not forever, and they will shut down, and there will be permanent scars on the economy. And in the conversation with Julia from the Bank of England earlier today, she said that she was expecting permanent scars, and I think that is right. What we will have to do is to recover from the pandemic and create, over 100 million jobs that have been destroyed by the pandemic in the process. So this is an opportunity to rethink the direction of the economy, not just in the energy sector, but in many areas. Do we have an appropriate balances between manufacturing and services and the intelligence economy, to use a really rather random phrase there, but do we have the right mix of skills? Given the move into AI, into digital, do we have the right capabilities in the economy, given that that's actually going to challenge our workforce, if you're interested in that? Another Oxford colleague, Dan Zuskin's book on the future of work has just been, was shortlisted by the FT for the Business Book of the Year prize. Great book. He didn't win it, but it's a very good book anyway. So we need to think about the structure of the economy. But it's also an opportunity to think about the structure of the energy system and to direct it to where it has to go. And here, my comments really relate rather directly to a nice question from Quentin Lewis. Thank you for the question, which is that if you look at past energy transitions, we haven't really ever got rid of a specific form of energy. We've added to them, and that's an accurate observation, Quentin, so good point. If we do that this time, we are fried. So we're not going to do that this time, because we are not completely stupid. Like, humans are pretty stupid quite a lot of the time, but we're also when the chips are down, we do tend to realize that it may make sense to do the right thing once we've exhausted all other alternatives, to butcher a phrase used by another, by a well-known phrase, put it that way. And we know that we need to decarbonize the energy system completely, or we simply don't have the civilization that we're currently enjoying. So Quentin, it is genuinely, so you can't argue with the laws of physics. This is why it's a when question and not an if question. And so we need to do a transition that we haven't done before. But humans are constantly doing things that we haven't done before. And as I like to put it, if you're looking to, sometimes it's useful to look for the past for guidance, and it is indeed useful here, but equally you shouldn't rely entirely on the past. So if you know that you've got a structural break coming, a shift in the landscape, then looking to the past to tell you what is definitely going to happen is not a good guide. So Sir David Hendry, fantastic econometrician here at Oxford, has done some of the world-leading work on structural breaks, and what they tell you is that the past isn't a great guide for the future. Or to put it another way, if you're walking backwards off a cliff, you're looking at the past in front of you as you walk backwards, and you're seeing a flat surface, and you're thinking, well, I'm safe. The past tells me that I'm walking on a flat surface, and it tells you that right until the moment you've fallen off the cliff. So, Quentin, good question, but it doesn't mean that we are screwed, to use a technical term. It just means we have to do things differently this time. And I think that's recognized. And so the point here on this slide is that we have to choose a new growth path, and we can use this period of disruption and, an unhappy period of disruption with lots of deaths, to chart a new course and to have something good come out of what is a pretty miserable situation. So that's where we are, the three phases: the induced downturn, which we're either still in or, partially out of and partially going back into, then the recovery, and then the long-term future. And what we have done at the Smith School with colleagues from the LSE and from Columbia and from Cambridge is to ask this question: will this pandemic accelerate progress on climate or slow it down? And when we published this paper in May, I hoped obviously that it would have some sort of impact, but it's had a humongous impact, and not just the sort of impact on the academic world, but we have been besieged by requests from different national governments to help with their recovery plans, which we're doing our best to answer. And the team is expanded, and maybe some of you watching are involved, in which case, thank you. And I think the reason that there's so much interest in this is because there's as I said right at the start, there's a much wider recognition that we have to construct a different system now, and that this is possibly the last major opportunity to do that. Because once you're back in business as usual, it's much more difficult to shift things. And moreover, what we're doing with the recovery is to bring forward investment to today, to create those jobs, to use the spare labor that we have in the economy, and to, I mean, that's the economist way of putting it. In more human terms, this is giving people livelihoods and making sure they don't starve. But we might as well use the capability that we have to build out this new system, to build out the insulation, to build out the EV charging points, to build out the bike lanes, as well as the batteries and the hydrogen economy and the clean infrastructure. This is a huge task, and suddenly we've got lots of capital, lots of money at very low interest rates looking for a home, and lots of labor, lots of people without jobs. So the cost of doing this is unreasonably low right now, and it won't be unreasonably low again. And further, if we put the money now into building out more fossil fuels, then, well, we'll be in a bit of a hole, because we'll have to write them off in 20 or 30 years, to use a phrase that has again gone viral, coming out of the Smith School and Ben Caldecott's work. There'll be stranded assets. So I think this is why there's a big interest in this work right now. I mean, the other reason is that citizens of the world clearly, there are majorities in favor of a green recovery. Whether it's in India, there at 81% of people favoring, either strongly agreeing or tending to agree that the green recovery is what they want, or even in the US with 57%. Our research, the Oxford paper, has been covered in over 600 press outlets. Our media folk tell us that the reach has been incredible. Perhaps over 1 billion, but I always have some degree of caution in interpreting those numbers. So I thought what I would do is just take you through this paper briefly, and then tease out the likely impacts for the energy sector. So let me do that. Quentin, I've seen your second question. Thank you very much. I will possibly come to that in Q&A. I think it doesn't fit quite nicely right now, but thank you for the question. And I encourage others to line them up there too, so that we can take them in the Q&A. Right, so the paper looked at 400 different stimulus policies from since the GFC, the global financial crisis. And we collected them into 25, or grouped them into 25 policy archetypes. And we surveyed 231, to be precise, economists, targeting economists in finance ministries and in central banks for their views on the overall desirability of these policies, as well as how fast could they work to re-stimulate the economy. What is their long-run economic multiplier? So this kind of fancy bit of language just means, by how much does national income rise for £1 or $1 of spending on this sort of stimulus? So, if £1 of spend gives you, £2 of increase in national income, then that is the multiplier on that policy. And in good economic periods, you can have multipliers that are less than 1, because government spending is actually reducing national income, for the reason that in order to do the government spending, you're having to tax people, and you're taking money out of the economy to put it back in. So if you've taken it out of productive areas and you're putting it into unproductive areas, then your multipliers could conceivably be less than 1, certainly in theory. and we can have a long debate between economists about where they lie. But in a period of a recession, you would expect multipliers on many policies to be much greater than 1, to the extent that there's a famous idea attributed to Keynes that you'd be better off digging holes and filling them in again than doing nothing, because it would get money flowing throughout your economy and start to increase confidence and other economic activity. So I have flippantly summarized the whole of this very significant piece of research as saying what we conclude, which I'll come to in a minute, is that if you're going to dig a hole and fill it in again, you might as well plant a tree in the hole before you fill it in again, and get yourself a productive asset out of the recovery process. So, but we were looking for policies that could be good on an economic dimension and strong on a climate dimension as well. And what we found is summarized in this chart here. You can see the 25 policies or a subset of them that relate specifically to recovery, because some were rescue policies, are plotted here in terms of their long-run economic multiplier. So high is good, you're stimulating the economy more, low is bad, and on their climate impact. So again, high is positive for the climate in terms of reducing emissions, and high negative there. And if we have a look at these policies, then you can see that the most desirable policy, remember these are not greenies that we're asking, these are economists in finance ministries and central banks. The most desirable policy is healthcare investment, but strongly desirable is clean energy infrastructure investment in terms of high climate, high multiplier. S is the highest on the economic dimension, which is connectivity infrastructure investment. So this is both the sorts of clean connectivity that we're connecting with each other now digitally, but also so clean ways of moving bits around and clean ways of moving flesh and blood around as well. So that's rated fairly highly. The other one to draw your attention to is R&D spending on clean issues here as Y, and X is general R&D spending, again considered to be strong on economic grounds and not too bad on climate as well. Although some of the researchers in my team are currently looking into that and debating that. So you start to build up a picture here of what we were looking for is there a subset of these policies that can help on the green agenda and on the economic agenda as well? And the answer, roughly is yes, there is. And there are policies that deliver you good multipliers, good economic job creation, etc., and also deliver you emission reductions. And in a sense, this shouldn't surprise, because we've known from past empirical research and estimates that if you put money into renewable energy, you create more jobs per unit of energy, per megawatt hour, for instance, in a clean energy plant than you do in a fossil plant. So normally that's not a good thing, because it means that you're higher cost. As it happens, a bunch of other costs are falling quite fast in clean energy. But normally you have a higher labor cost. And if your economy is at full employment, then you want people to be doing whatever they're doing productively and getting on with things, rather than diverting them to be installing wind turbines necessarily. I mean, there are many other reasons for diverting people to be installing wind turbines, but the kind of opportunity cost of that labor is high. But when you're in a recession and you've got a lot of spare capacity in the economy, the fact that clean energy investment creates more jobs per megawatt hour is a massive bonus. So effectively, you're putting in the cost now up front, and it's in labor and capital. And then what you don't have to do is pay for the next 40 years on fuel. So it's a way of saying we've got cheap labor, we've got cheap capital. Let's forward pay for something that we're going to be using for the next 40 years, because those factor inputs will be much more expensive down the line. So I hope that makes some sense. If it doesn't, we can try and explore that a bit more in the Q&A. But just to summarize the findings of the paper, which is based partly on the survey, partly on some other analysis and literature review. But we highlighted these 5 policies that could help us get out of the pandemic and help us get us onto the right trajectory from a clean energy and climate angle. So physical infrastructure investment in clean energy and in clean infrastructure is number 1. 2, building energy efficiency and just make sure we're not leaking energy out of our commercial and our residential estate. 3rd, with so many unemployed people, but also so many new skills to be developed, whether it's in mass installation of electrolyzers or in mass carbon capture or in EV charge point capabilities or power electronics. I mean, you name it, there's a whole kind of chunk of the economy that is there to be built. And we need to skill up and get an army of people who can do that. And now is a really good time to do that. We also highlighted investment in natural capital. So we know from the Committee on Climate Change that and this is less an energy issue, but there's still a big opportunity to take CO2 out of the air and put it into the soils and into plants. And actually natural capital also gives you other services like flood resilience, habitats for biodiversity, etc. So it's not just planting trees, it's planting a variety of an ecosystem of appropriate variety for species of an appropriate variety to be in, and for the services to be the ecosystem services to emerge from there. And you can do that in a socially distant way, so it's a bit of a winner. And then clean R&D spending as well. And we highlight in the paper a set of co-benefits that aren't just economic and environmental. You get some social and some health benefits here, because of course if you reduce local pollution, you increase health. There's emerging, growing and pretty compelling literature on the health damage done by pollution, and also the economic damage done by pollution. In fact, in general, there's increasing recognition that these things are quite tightly bound up. The environment, health, and the economy all go hand in hand. And the pandemic happened because we were interfering with species in ways that we shouldn't have been doing. You may find that there are more of these pandemics as climate change and habitat destruction happens. We certainly, as I said, know that some of the environmental variables directly affect health, which affects the economy. It's not just pollution. There's great work being done by a former Oxford student, Ji-Sung Park, on the impacts of heat on productivity, looking at exam test scores on days with different weather when the aircon isn't on. So anyway, there's a bunch of these co-benefits that can be pieced together. But delivering success here isn't just simply about doing the theory. Being in there in the guts of the policy-making machine and doing things astutely really, really matters, as we've seen in recent months. Now, let me just see. I see a few possible questions here. Right, so Sylvester's asked a good one. Let me answer that one now. It fits in with the flow. So, how do we do this clean energy infrastructure investment? It's a great question. Is it subsidies and grants, or is it direct spending from the government? And Sylvester, it can be a mix of both. I mean, this question arises really acutely when I have these sorts of discussions with, say, the member countries of the African Development Bank, or there are a number of economies around the world that don't feel like they have what's called the fiscal space, the ability to spend at the government level to trigger these changes and to spend their way out of the pandemic and to get a recovery. And in those economies, all is not lost, because really the task at hand here is to deliver confidence back to your economy. Now, I mean, you don't want confidence of the sort that then goes and kills a lot of people because I'm feeling confident, so I'm going to go out to the pub and get plastered and then catch COVID and then transmit it to 10 other people. Or you undergraduates, beware. But we do want the sort of confidence that will allow the economy to be reestablished and to be rebuilt. And you can do that without direct government spending. Although, of course, it really helps if the private sector can see that the government has skin in the game. Either they're putting in some money in terms of grants or first loss positions or something like a contract for difference, they're backing the agenda in a way that isn't going to flip-flop around with the next incoming administration. But it can be done in ways that don't involve direct spending. So regulatory interventions, banning or signaling a ban is coming on certain technologies can lead the private sector to reinvest in other technologies. Right, and actually I think that partially answers Jessica's question too about what sort of incentives are needed to drive and accelerate these private investments. And then the first part of your question, Jessica, in terms of prioritizing clean energy infrastructure, which one comes first? Good question. I mean, I think this depends on the country. So in countries where you're a long way through your decarbonization process for the grid, say, then you might wish to focus on the transport sector and light passenger vehicles. But to be honest, in many countries, kind of all of these things need doing, now effectively. So it's not really an either or. It's not a very good answer to your question. I admit that, because you want me to say, well, if we've got limited money, let's do this and then this and then this. But actually, it's we do need to do all of them at the same time. And you even if you don't do everything immediately. So a good example. So if we were in conversation, Jessica, you might say to me, but we don't know what the right solution is to decarbonize heat yet. Is it heat pumps, air source or ground source, or is it hydrogen through the grid? We don't want to do everything all at the same time. But my answer there would be, well, we know what we need right now to do is a set of pathfinders in this area. So take a few areas and say, well, we're going to do what needs to be done to upgrade the grid infrastructure so that we can have heat pumps sorting out the zero carbon heating challenge in these areas. And maybe, say up in Leeds, where they've got the big hydrogen project underway, we might try looking at using hydrogen in that area. So the fact that you don't exactly know the full path of national travel at this stage, I mean, I'm sure many people will be thinking, oh, I know exactly what it is, but there'll be as many saying it's definitely heat pumps as there are saying it's definitely hydrogen, I dare say, or something else. So yeah, we do need to get going there too. So it's a slight cop out of an answer, I admit that, but it's a good question. Goodness, there's some good questions coming in here now. I might just, so some of them I'm about to answer. In fact, let me take John's question right now. What proportion of the recovery so far has been green? And let me answer that by giving you some numbers. So as we look at the recovery stimulus plans for different countries and regions, you can see that pretty significant amounts of money are now going into the green recovery, or at least are being pledged, because there is a distinction between governments pledging money and it actually being spent. But the signs here are very promising. I mean, if you think, so this is not the case that if you see 30%, say there for the EU, that it's 30% green and 70% fossil. That's not what we're saying here. It's 30% green and 70% other, like colorless. So if there's green and brown and colorless, this is the very directed green bit. And so to see such large numbers being directed to green spending is very significant, John. Now it was a very small proportion of the overall rescue funds that were used to prop up the economy, which now I think 11 to 12 trillion last time I checked globally. So it's not as if that we suddenly have 10 trillion flowing into a clean recovery. We don't. Most of that has been colorless. Most of it's just simply making sure that people have enough to eat. If they had a job that was viable for the future, they've still got it when they come out of lockdown, etc. But for the recovery piece, here are some of the numbers, and they're looking reasonably solid, is what I would say. The other thing to say here, John, is that there's an awful lot more to come here with so many people unemployed, with the Americans, for various understandable reasons, haven't been able to get their act together on a stimulus and recovery plan. We expect that that's likely to happen once the elections are done and dusted, whoever gets in. And then, of course, how that plan looks will presumably depend rather significantly on who the next president of the US is. In the case of China, as I said at the start, the current 5-year plan is still being finalized, and the fact that we've seen Xi Jinping's statement last month is a positive. It may not adjust the details that much, but one hopes that it does affect the details. And even the UK, I mean, these are small numbers, relatively speaking, but there's one expects more to come out of the Treasury, put it that way, in the UK, and I dare say it will in due course. So there's an awful lot more to come here, and you can look at the overall response so far and say, well, it kind of hasn't really been very clean. But you can also look at it in a positive way. And let me give you a bit more detail on the positive. So if I just take hydrogen as an example, here is some stats on global public hydrogen research and development spending. Again, thanks to Brian Callahan and co-author. And hydrogen has been growing at 3.5% per annum until this year, and the spending has shot up by 500% in a single year. Now that's not going to have no effect, as I put here in the title. It's shifting the narrative here. We know that Saudi Arabia is investing $5 billion into a major hydrogen and then ammonia production, green, so from electrolysis. If you're in Australia looking at this, you think, well, our largest exports are coal and gas. Are they going to be our largest exports in 20 years' time, 30 years' time? Maybe not. We'd probably better make sure that we don't completely waste the energy assets that we have in the form of the sun and the wind, which is very cheap in Australia. And I say this as an Australian. And so there's a sense that the race is on now, partly as a result of this spending through COVID and the fact that many countries have seen the opportunity to reorient their economies. Right. So I'm just having another look at the questions. I'll leave them for the minute. So where are we heading? I mean, that's the exam questions. I'm trying to give you some insight on here. Hopefully I'm not completely failing. One thing that we know is that uncertainty is significantly increased as a result of COVID. You have, on the one hand, the traditional OPEC, so this is the oil-producing countries based in Vienna, but you can think of this as Saudi Arabia and Russia, roughly, with apologies to all those other countries in OPEC. But that view is that nothing much has changed. We're going to continue using oil. We're going to continue to emit. We don't have a climate problem. Nothing to see here. Yada yada. On the other hand, you've got thoughtful and respectable companies, large companies like Shell and BP, really starting to grasp the fact that actually this transition, not only does it have to happen, it will happen. It's a question of time. If they don't get with the program, they're going to have a lot of stranded assets. We've already seen significant impairments on the balance sheets of the oil companies because the oil prices collapse. But in the process of taking those impairments, the companies have said, well, actually, we think that the future looks a bit different to how it did in the past, and prices are probably structurally lower from here on. So comparing, thanks to the FT here, the nice simple comparison between your OPEC projections for oil consumption and your BP projections under business as usual, a rapid transition or a net zero transition. I mean, this is a pretty wide uncertainty band. Now, I love this quote from the OPEC annual report, which is just recently out. The fact that it's mostly European international oil companies that are redirecting interest in investments towards renewables suggests that there is a cultural element to their thinking. Perhaps this is more influenced by domestic debates. Now, I don't doubt that there is a difference between the oil-producing countries, exporters, and the European countries who are largely net importers of fossil energy. Of course, the interests are different. And if you know anything about behavioral economics and psychology, it's that beliefs do tend to follow interests. And if you're an academic, you have to work hard to ensure that either you have no interests at all, or if you do have interests, your beliefs are, where possible, contrary to your interests. But I would say there is a cultural element here, and I'd say it's culturally hardly surprising that OPEC thinks that business as usual production will continue and oil growth will continue to rise. And the question, rather than about whether it's cultural, is which one is completely unrealistic. And we will see. Maybe the net zero projection is completely unrealistic, but maybe growing oil production in a context of ice sheets permanently melting and global enthusiasm for a green recovery is unrealistic. Consider that a challenge. Anyone from OPEC listening, because I realize this is a public discussion, not a private one, effectively, come and let's put some money on it. We have a betting book in the New College SCR. I have made a bet on energy markets in there. Let's just say the last one I comprehensively won. I'm looking forward to another bet. So if I have a taker from OPEC, let me know and you can come around and we'll put that on the books. Right, so I'm realizing that time is running short. So let me just kind of wrap up with a bit of a sense of direction, then we can jump into some Q&A. So what happens next? So we've seen the climate context, the COVID response. I've said the system's at a point of criticality. This could be the shock that tips us into a faster acceleration towards an energy transition that is unlike the previous energy transitions. Now, the reason I think this could be what is next is because of the dynamics in the system. You may have seen these sorts of things before. Hopefully, Chris will go into them in more detail, or subsequent speakers in this series. But the dynamics of clean energy are fundamentally different to the dynamics of fossil energy because of the following. The more you produce, the cheaper they get. And the reason for that is that the cost structure of the sun does not change. The cost structure of the wind does not change. But the cost structure, which is a good thing, because actually if you're exploiting more and more difficult to extract fossils, the cost structure goes up as you need to produce more and more of them. But the cost structure of scale manufacturing and intellectual input into those technologies pushes costs down. Basically, there's a lot of scientists, a lot of engineers having clever ideas about how to produce a panel, whether it's Oxford PV, a spin out from Oxford that's using perovskites and layering them on top of silicon to capture a larger array of the light spectrum. That sort of activity, many others, will help to pull costs down by increasing efficiencies. The process of scaling up these plants, building bigger and bigger plants, more and more production, it's like an iPhone or a computer. The costs come down because you can scale manufacture at very low cost. And this is true also in batteries, and it's true also in electric vehicles. And then there are dynamics between these areas. So, the more batteries you produce, the cheaper they get. The cheaper batteries are, the more you want to build them. But of course, batteries are a huge chunk of the cost of an EV. So the more batteries you're producing, the cheaper EVs are getting, and the more you produce EVs, electric vehicles that is, the more you're producing batteries. The more you've got batteries, the higher the value from your renewables, so you produce more renewables, which makes them cheaper. The more renewables you have, the more the intermittency in the grid, the more you want batteries, so you produce more batteries, et cetera, et cetera. So these feedbacks exist in the tech area that I think could accelerate the transition. Well, they are. I mean, they're already operating too. This is not a could, actually. They are accelerating the transition to a clean energy future. And then there are a set of more complicated feedbacks across civil society, government, business, consumer, and citizen behavior that mean that once we get over this tipping point, things start to change more quickly. I mean, who wants to put R&D money into a technology that we know is dead, where banks don't want to finance it anymore, customers don't want to buy it anymore? Who wants to take money as a politician from an industry that is dead or dying? you look tarnished. All these things shift. I mean, we know that consumers of solar panels vote differently. They're more likely to vote for a green candidate. Now, you've got to do your careful econometrics and control for all the relevant variables. Somebody who is more likely to vote that way is more likely to buy a solar panel. But once you do that, you still see that the shift in behavior as a consumer shifts your behavior as a citizen, and vice versa, and so on. So all of these kind of feedbacks are working to give us hope here. And looking at the clock, let me wrap up and take a few more questions. So to summarize, we've seen COVID-19 upending conventional wisdom in many sectors, and in other sectors like the digital sector or online shopping or whatever, it's accelerating changes that are already underway. Now, my contention is that actually COVID-19 could well accelerate the changes that are already underway in a small way in the energy sector. COVID-19 could push it over the edge. And we've seen the impairments in oil and gas balance sheets, 50 billion. They were coming anyway. I mean, there's a bunch of assets there that we just simply can't dig up and burn out of the ground. We don't want to. And the oil majors are now recognizing that and writing them off. Basically, I mean, if you're chief executive of one of these companies, you want to have the lowest cost structure. That's always true, but it's particularly true if your demand is coming in and your residual demand for fossil fuels is getting smaller. You need to be close to being the last man standing, or last person standing, excuse the gendered language. And the recent reports, in the last couple of weeks from the International Energy Agency and from BP do show the extent to which these ideas are starting to become mainstream. There's a bunch of things in the IA report which we've never seen before in terms of a proper and for once realistic assessment of the declines in renewable energy. The IA has been infamously badly wrong year on year in its projections of renewable energy costs. With apologies to Fatty and to Lara, you know it, I know it, and it's great to see a shift in this report. So well done. And then, the final thing I want to say is that I'm not by any stretch of the imagination saying that net zero by 2050 is easy. It's a huge undertaking requiring transformation across multiple sectors, not only the energy sector, other sectors as well. And the fact that there is an energy transition, that it's underway, that it's going to accelerate, doesn't mean that we will get to net zero in time. Right, so Izzy, that's it for the slides. Maybe you can, or is it me? Yeah, thanks, great. So pull them down and let's get stuck into some Q&A. So let me pick up on Leon's question. Is there any evidence that BP and other oil producers are aiming for net zero, or is it marketing greenwash? And it's absolutely correct, Leon, that they make most of their revenue from oil and fossil fuels. It's kind of, I think, still difficult for an interested observer to really understand whether these companies are committed. And all I can say is that I'm lucky enough to feel like I'm on Shell's advisory board, and we talk with the executive team at BP, and my sense is that they are committed. They're sensible, intelligent people. They've seen that this system has to change. They realize that they're either going out of business. I mean, this is their Kodak choice here. I mean, you either transition fast and at the pace, to use, I think, Shell's language, the pace of move along with the pace of society, or even better, you're slightly ahead of that curve so that you're not caught behind, because the energy infrastructure is very slow moving. You install capital in an energy asset, and it could be around for 30, 40, 50, 60, or in some cases 70 years. So, that's why the Shell team almost invented the process of creating long-run scenarios, because they need to see this stuff coming and to have the right set of assets in place so they're not caught out. So, my sense is that this isn't greenwash. I think, to be completely frank, I'm pretty sure those companies are aware that they would be losing their social license to operate in the European markets if they didn't do something like this. I mean, I don't know how many of you would relish going to work for a dirty old coal company, but you might still consider an oil and gas company that is committed to net zero and is transitioning and has really quite exciting units doing new energies in both of those companies. So you can be part of the solution, and moving a rather large institution into these profitable future is actually kind of a fairly exciting thing to do. Whereas going and working for, well, there aren't that many coal players here in the UK anymore, but working for Peabody or something that's going bankrupt in the US is hardly an enticing proposition. So I don't see it as greenwash. I think there is an eye on the social license to operate, obviously, and there is caution about going too quickly. But honestly, I think they probably should be more cautious about going too slowly here. But time will tell. Right, there's a new question. There's some existing questions from those who've already asked questions, but let me pick up on another one. So Tom has asked about negative feedback loops in renewable rollout and self-cannibalization. So this is a good question, Tom. Thank you. So those of you who are not aware, self-cannibalization is that when if you've got a wind farm, when the wind blows, obviously your turbine runs, but so does the turbine next door and the other ones if they're correlated in wind speed. And so you have this rush of wind onto the grid. And as with any market, if you have a sudden increase in supply of something and demand stays where it would otherwise be, then your prices fall. So what's called the capture price for wind electricity can end up being lower than the capture price for other forms of electricity because the wind is correlated with each other. So one way of managing that is to make sure that you've got wind plants in locations around the country geographically where the wind is not correlated. But you can't, there's a limit on how much you can do that, obviously. It's not a huge island that we live on here. You can use interconnection, but again, that's expensive and that's limited. There's more of them coming in, but we don't have 40 gigawatts of interconnection here. But what is increasingly being seen as the way to balance up a system with very large amounts of renewables in a clean way is using batteries, which can respond very quickly and very cheaply, and or the production of, or the flexible use of that energy to produce hydrogen or some other chemical carrier of the energy. So I think those sorts of negative loops are there but can be managed. The other, I guess, constraint that people talk about in the rollout of renewable energy is the particular minerals that are used in the turbines. Again, it's not to say that there's no issue here, but it's a manageable issue, even as you look out to very, very large amounts of EVs or large amounts of turbines and solar PV. I mean, they're largely made from pretty abundant materials. Many of you will know about problems of cobalt. We just saw at Tesla's battery day that actually you can get rid of the cobalt, move it to nickel. It's cheaper mineral, and you can make the batteries work as well on a cost basis. So, look, I think so, Tom. I mean, the fundamentally honest answer is that getting up to 100% renewables is tricky because of the reason that you can have in a country like this one in the UK, it can be tricky because you have challenges about long-term storage. If you have a period of a number of weeks where there isn't much wind and it happens to be in the winter, that's not going to happen every year, but it might happen 1 in 30 years, and you don't want your whole economy to fall over 1 in 30 years because you don't have enough energy. So the challenge there is finding enough backup or storage capacity to manage those periods. And it may be that what works there is to use old gas stations, or maybe they're hydrogen turbines. These are open questions. They're interesting questions. And actually, Sir Chris Llewellyn-Smith, who is at Oxford and who has been leading efforts in energy over many years, is working on a major report for the Royal Society, the peak scientific body here in the UK, on managing this. And I guess the bottom line is if you can solve this problem in the UK, you can solve it anywhere in a sense, because we have the most annoying system where you've got a mismatch between supply and demand. I mean, in other countries where you have your peak load, like in Australia, for instance, your peak load is in the middle of summer on a hot day because everybody's turning on the air conditioner. But that's also the point in time where you've got the most sun coming in. So you've got a better correlation. Now, Izzy, let me just turn back to you to ask. I'm conscious that I think I'm over time. I'm not sure how many more minutes you expect or have for further questions. There's a few more lined up here.
Don't worry, we can, because this is YouTube, so we can just keep going or end when you feel appropriate. Don't worry, Cameron.
Okay, well, I'll take the few that are lined up here, and then I'll go and have some dinner, if that's okay. So going back a bit, so Lauernord 1, I guess that's, I'm not going to try and interpret that, but so has asked or made a comment actually about the background, and maybe this isn't a question, that the markets for green technologies are dominated by a few countries. Oh, and actually, sorry, yes, you asked a previous question. To what extent is sustainable, resilient, and inclusive growth applicable to developing countries? So let me try and put those two things together, perhaps. So developing countries are in more need of growth than developed economies, so to the extent that your growth in economic output is more valuable in terms of human welfare, right? I mean, if you're living in poverty, then going up from $1 a day to $10 a day, or even to $2 or $3 a day, it makes a massive and significant difference to your life. So those who argue that we need to stop growth at a global level really should just remind themselves that there's a billion people living in poverty, and probably more, well, definitely more now after the pandemic. So growth is certainly applicable to developing countries. To what extent should it be sustainable and resilient and inclusive? Well, I mean, there's no point creating growth that enriches your kind of elites at the top 0.1% in an otherwise poor country. So it has to be inclusive for it to be sensible. And equally, there's not much point embarking on unsustainable growth. I mean, honestly, I guess unsustainable growth is better than no growth at all, probably in those countries. It's not in rich countries. But sustainable growth is better than unsustainable growth. It's almost a truism. And you might as well be building up expertise, skills, labor, capital, financing capability, legal, government capability in the industries and technologies of the future that are more secure and more socially beneficial than in the industries of the past, where not only is your capital insecure and could be stranded, but you might end up stranding your labor and losing jobs and then creating another problem for yourself down the line. So in a sense, it's a no-brainer to have sustainable, resilient, and inclusive growth. Why doesn't it happen? I hear you ask. Well, I mean, there's a bunch of deeply political and political economy reasons around the way many countries, including rich countries, operate. We don't have political classes that always act in the best interests of people as a whole everywhere. So that's just a reality of life. So let me move along to I think Leon's second question. Is it possible to encourage companies like BP and Shell to transition from a government point of view? So what can the government do to help this transition along? Or would it be better for them to be broken down? So this is a good question. I think it's a properly serious question. If you are a coal company and you've had profitable decades extracting coal, or maybe you're a company that produces turbines for coal-fired power stations, which of these companies should pivot and become profitable in a future landscape, and which companies should just say, right, well, we are going to run the course of this mine, say, we're going to extract the coal that is needed for the plants that still exist, and then we're going to shut down. And we're not going to pretend that we're going to suddenly become a solar panel installer, because there are a bunch of solar panel installers, and they're quite good at doing what they do, and we're good at digging up coal. And maybe the fact that we're good at digging up coal means we've got no comparative advantage at all in putting in solar panels. So there are certainly some companies and some assets where what you want here is a sensible decline of the asset. You want it to be profitable and to be reasonable, and for the people who work in those industries to be looked after, and a whole kind of collective stakeholder management. You probably need the managers or the chief executives of those sorts of assets and companies to be incentivized to look after all of the stakeholders and manage the decline, run off the cash, run off the dividends, pay out to shareholders, look after your staff, and shut the stuff down. But then there are other companies where it's a little bit more of a moot question. So if you're making turbines for maybe gas turbines that you're used to, steam or gas or coal-based turbines, we still need a lot of turbines in the power system. So there's probably a role for those companies to pivot, to start thinking about what a hydrogen turbine would look like, or an ammonia turbine could look like, or even a wind turbine. Although the market there is, Siemens, for instance, make fossil turbines and they make wind turbines. Or to go to an integrated energy player, let me take Exxon for an example. They have, like any of the oil companies, actually BP or Shell or Total or Eni or Repsol, they've all got capabilities offshore. Now, if you're building wind farms, you need offshore capabilities. They have capabilities in, what they do fundamentally is to get the energy to the customer at the time, in the form, and at the price that is acceptable. And that function is still needed. We're going to need to be getting electrons to customers in the right place, at the right time, in the right form. So, it's no longer, if you've got an EV, you no longer have to get petrol or some petroleum product to your vehicle. You need to get electrons into your vehicle. But actually, these companies are often quite good at trading and managing and delivering energy, whether it's electrons or liquid fuels. And they're also good at managing customer relationships. Shell, for instance, note that they sell more coffee than Starbucks do. So those sorts of relationships with customers are also needed. So look, I think it's an open question. I mean, I'm on record as saying that this is going to be very hard for the integrated oil companies to transition. But that is true of any big incumbent faced with an existential threat. It's very hard to grasp the threat, to reorient the organization, the strategy, the people, the incentives, the structures in the company, the technology, to have a profitable role in the future when you've got pure plays like, for instance, in wind, in Ørsted, developing very well there, or pure plays in solar PV installation and manufacturing. But there is a role for these integrators, so I wouldn't say it's all done and dusted. Look, Izzy, this is. Let me stop there. There are still some outstanding questions. Apologies if I didn't answer your question, and apologies we've had to do this digitally. I look forward to next year. Many of you will still be around. If you invite me back, I look forward to a more lively in-person debate and discussion.
Thank you very much. That was very, very insightful. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.